I forget. And welcome to the Forestry lunch breaks. Really appreciate you all joining. I'm sure several more people will continue to trickle in. So this week we are focusing on root rots. For those of you that haven't joined in our past forestry lunch breaks this year, the whole idea is short, little bite-sized lessons, but an opportunity to kind of go on a deep dive into a particular topic. And root rots is obviously something that most forest owners face, especially on the west side in Washington. So I'm guessing as forest owners, most of you have some experience in this, or if not, you will probably at some point in your life. So a couple logistics first before I introduce our speaker. As I already mentioned, make sure that your chat box is set to 2 or set to everyone in the 2 setting there. It's just a little drop-down box when you open up the chat box. This makes sure that we can all see what questions are being asked. And on that note, feel free to ask questions throughout the session. We will be waiting, though, to get to them to the very end. But I strongly encourage you to continue to ask questions as they come up for you while Rachel's talking. And the last piece is that these sessions are going to be recorded, and they will all be available on this website. I'm usually able to get them up same day, but if not, it'll be 1 to 2 days at the most, and they will be up there basically in perpetuity. So you can, as long as you keep that link, you can go back and rewatch the recordings anytime you want. All right, well, I am going to stop sharing there and introduce Rachel Brooks. Rachel's a forest pathologist with the Washington Department of Natural Resources. Some of you may know her from some of our other programs like the Family Forest Field Day or maybe winter schools. I'm not sure what all programs you've been involved with, Rachel, but she's helped us with lots of these classes, and she's certainly an expert when it comes to root rots. And we will have Rachel 3 out of 4 days this week. And then it sounds like on Wednesday, Dan Amdahl, another pathologist, will be joining us. So we're in good hands.
Awesome. Thank you, Patrick. Do you mind muting yourself? Because there is an echo when you are not muted. Perfect. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for signing in. Someone just made a joke that I was the root rot lunch lady. So I'm going to embrace that and be the serving up some root rot for you today during your lunch break. Once again, my name is Rachel. I'm a forest pathologist with the Washington State Department of Natural Resources. I am based in Olympia, Washington, but do cover the entire state. So don't be shy if you feel like you're far away from the capital. Okay, so for those of you that have interacted with which is a group of just a few for our state. Private land. We have cohorts in the Forest Service, the Federal Forest Service, that do our federal land and also our tribal land, but we work with them closely. And we do anything from monitoring pests and pathogens, like this outreach event, and we do some research as well, which is always one of my favorite parts. This is a very small part of what DNR does, so feel free to use their new and improved landowner assistance portal. It's easy to find if you just Google that. It can help you find all the other things DNR does, including your local service forester or cost share programs or permits and regulations. That website knows more than I do about all those different topics. So keep that on your radar if you have any DNR specific questions that fall outside of forest health. Okay, so this is a 4-part series, Monday through Thursday during your lunch. Today we'll be talking about root rots and the
Rachel, can I stop you?
rots.
Rachel?
Yes.
So I don't know if anyone else is getting some stops in your feed. I am. It might be good for us to turn our videos off to kind of save some broadband. I'll go ahead to.
2 is root rot species ID and disease cycle. This will be actually talking about science and how do you identify which root rot is in a suspected root rot area.
Hey, Rachel. Rachel,
Yes.
we're still getting a lot of cutting out.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to do about that at this point. I don't know if you have like an maybe any other.
I can let me see if I
Might
can
have-
find phone call, the phone number to call in.
Okay. Do you need that? I can send that to you if you don't have it.
I think I found the number.
Of course, you sound fine now. So
Yeah, that's how it always works, isn't it?
yeah. And
Uh,
I mean, it could be just like a program on your computer that's sucking up some bandwidth too. But
Yeah, I turned everything off, but that's just how it goes when you're working at home sometimes. So let me just call in, and that usually fixes everything.
okay, great. Well, let's everyone will just sit tight for a second and get this figured out. For those in the chat, we're still getting this figured out. Rachel's going to be calling in her audio via phone, so just another couple minutes, we'll get back on track.
Okay, how is that? Patrick, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, hopefully this works. Sorry, it took a little bit to figure out how to unmute myself on the phone, but I think I am there now. Okay. So moving on, moving through the schedule, you probably had lots of time to look at it, so I think I will move on. Okay, I'm going to start with today, a little bit of basic background so we're all on the same page. Just a quick reminder that tree health is very different than forest health. This is true for a lot of reasons, but specifically because our objectives are different at these different scales. When we're looking at a single tree, we might be concerned about how safe is it? Is it going to fall down? Is it aesthetically pleasing? Does it provide shade, etc.? But when we're looking at an entire forest, we like to think about bigger picture things like, is this forest providing timber resources? Is it providing recreation resources or wildlife habitat? And because of those two different scales, the definition of healthy changes with that and what we look at that. So when we talk about what is a healthy forest, what does that look like? My answer is always it depends. And that's because, yes, every single forest that's healthy provides some basic ecosystem services, such as erosion control, carbon sequestration, etc. However, a healthy forest is one that also meets landowner objectives. And there's a large group here, and I know you guys would all disagree as a whole on what the objective of each given individual forest is. And so because of that, what is healthy depends on what your objectives are. And on top of that, we also like to see forests that are resilient to disturbances, meaning that if there is some stressor or disturbance agent out there that puts pressure on the forest, it can still not only meet those basic ecosystem service requirements, but also still continue to meet your landowner objectives. And there's a lot of things that can influence whether a forest is healthy or not. Here's a list that's not comprehensive of certain things that can impact a single tree, and then on larger scales, an entire forest. On the left, we have abiotic or non-living things. They range from everything from mechanical damage to temperature extremes, etc. But on the right, we have the living things, which is of somewhat more interest to most of us, and include on the list fungi and water molds. Water molds are just fungi-like organisms, not completely related to fungi though. And these are the ones that we're going to be focused on today, as these are the ones that cause root rot diseases. However, a lot of these other things on both of the sides of these lists can impact tree roots. So they are still there, they can still cause problems. We're just focusing in on the fungi and water molds that impact tree roots today. And I always like to go into this because whenever I talk about things that can kill trees, it can get a little bit depressing. So I want to remind everyone that there are a lot of positive impacts for what these disturbance agents do. They can provide a lot of services to your forest, including natural thinning. This means that they're reducing competition from neighboring trees to let other healthier trees grow and expand. They provide lots of important wildlife habitat. Those dead trees are very important for a lot of our wildlife species. They play a huge role in decomposition, sort of recycling nutrients in the forest system, and they help keep our forests diverse. They make things more varied, allow different species to thrive in certain areas, and just the age structure of a forest to be different too. So all these positive impacts means that a healthy forest does include dead trees. And that's important to remember, especially when you guys get to your management discussion on day 3 about what you want to do about these root rots. Now, of course, there's negative impacts too. These are especially true for economic losses, such as a reduction in timber, or ecosystem costs, such as a reduction in wildlife habitat or erosion control. Overall, these are the most significant if we're dealing with a non-native disturbance agent. So something that did not co-evolve with our system can cause huge negative impacts. Or if it's something that's native but is exaggerated by climate change or mismanagement, can also have large-scale negative impacts in our forests. But for a lot of these disease agents out there, they're a native part of our forest, and their negative impacts tend not to be as huge. So what is the most important disturbance agent out there? Well, it depends. I always joke that it's the one that's in your backyard is the one that's the most important. And I think what we'll find is in a lot of forests throughout Western Washington, you do have root rots in your backyard, and you just might not have noticed them yet. So I do think it's one that is worthwhile spending a lot of time on. And so before I jump into specifically root rots, I do want to just do a little background in rot in general. Rot or decay, it's the same thing, is the breakdown of wood by microorganisms. This is mainly fungi, and you guys have all seen rotted wood. There's discoloration to the wood, and there's a sort of an overall lack of structure and loss. What you might not have known is that there's actually different types of rot out there, sort of categorized into what I'm going to go over 3 different types. The first is referred to as white rot. And these different types of rot vary in what components of wood are degraded by the fungi or microorganism. In white rot, all different parts of the wood is degraded. So this includes the hemicellulose, the cellulose, and the lignin. And here's an electron scanning microscope where you just see there's portions of cell walls that are missing. Following this, there's brown rot. This degrades the hemicellulose and the cellulose, but the lignin is left behind. And you can see in this electron scanning microscope image that it causes sort of the structure to crumble. And then soft, or sometimes it's called dry rot, though I don't like the term dry rot because moisture is still a problem. It degrades hemicellulose, cellulose, and some lignin, but this happens within the cell walls of wood, so a little different. And this soft rot only occurs in dead wood, so it's not something we're going to be paying attention to, and hopefully not something you run into in, say, your house or something. But white rot and brown rot can occur both on living tissue caused by a disease or in dead wood, just happening by like a saprophyte or something that just decomposes dead wood and not living tissue. So what do these actually look like? Well, their names are nice and easy to remember. White rot tends to be white. It tends to be very fibrous or stringy. And though it can be spongy at times or laminated, we'll look at some of those examples tomorrow. Or rarely it does occur in these little pockets. Only small portions of the wood have white rot. In contrast, we have brown rot. Just like their name sounds, they are brown. These are the ones that crumble, so they are cross-checked or cubical in nature, and pretty clearly well-defined. Now, for the most part, we'll be talking about white rots today, but on day 4, we will talk about a couple brown rots. Rots can happen all throughout a tree, and based on where in the tree they are happening, they typically get referred to by different names. So, for example, top rot just means it's rot that's happening in the branches, all the way through this list to heart rot, which is rot that's happening in the heartwood of the tree or the center. Today, we'll be talking about root rots, and I will mention that sometimes root rots do go up into that butt region of the tree, and you will hear them referred to as butt rots as well, and we'll talk about one of those on Thursday. So root rots are exactly what they sound. They're just rots that happen in the roots of a living tree by a microorganism. And you can see in this picture, the outcome is exactly what you expect. There are few or limited roots on a tree, and the wood there is rotted. Compared to this tree on the right that fell over, where its roots were intact, the roots just had trouble penetrating into the deeper soil, so the tree was wind thrown in a storm. And these root rots are pretty common in our Western Washington forest, or in most forests actually. So it's good to know what to look for, especially since a lot of this rot is happening underground and it's hard to see. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is root rot stand symptoms. These are things that we look for on sort of a larger scale that starts us thinking about and wondering if we have a root rot problem or a presence on our property. The main 4 things I look for when I'm in the woods dealing with root rots are I look for pockets of symptomatic trees. And you can see in this picture, it's sort of clustered, declining or dead trees all within the same area. And we'll learn about why that happens tomorrow. The next thing you want to look for is within this area, you'll see several stages of slowly declining trees. In other words, you'll see trees that have been long dead, trees that are standing that don't have any branches, trees that are standing that still have their fine branches, and trees that are standing and still alive but not looking so great. So it's a slow disease, so that happens on the site for a long period of time. So you want to see indications that this has been going on for a while and is not just an abrupt new thing. Additionally, the trees that have fallen, they tend to be in a jacksaw pattern, meaning they're pointing in all different directions. This is in contrast to, say, a windstorm that would push all the trees over, all pointing the same direction. And then lastly, you may see a bunch of regeneration of other species or even of young susceptible species that are taking advantage of that sort of light and resource availability in this area of decline of like the larger trees. If you're seeing these type of situations, you would then want to go and look at individual trees more closely. So once you start looking at individual trees in this area, the most important thing you are looking for is root or butt rot. And that sort of confirms that you have a root rot problem. I will be spending most of the time tomorrow talking about what specifically to look for and how to look for this. So I'll skip over it for the most part today, but do know that is the number one thing we look for when we're in the field. So you can see some other things. For example, depending on species of tree and on the root rot disease, you may see resinosis on the root collar. This is just sort of the production of sap outside of the tree, indicating that there's an interaction of something going on underneath the bark, in this case, a root rot disease. You may also look up to the trees that are still alive and see them declining. And one thing we look for is this thin and discolored crown. Root rots are sort of slow killers of trees. So this thinning and discoloration tends to happen from the bottom up and the inside out. This is in contrast to, say, like bark beetles that tend to kill trees quickly, where you won't have any of this thinning, the tree will just die suddenly. Or, for example, droughts that tend to kill trees from the top down and the outside in. Another thing you look for is sort of a reduction in growth. The easiest way for you to do this is to look up to the top of your trees and look for that leading branch. This is the tall center branch, the one that you would put like a Christmas star on your Christmas tree. You want to look at the height of this branch, if it's putting on a lot of growth or not. And what we see in trees that are sort of slowing down in the growth because they have some sort of stressor, in this case, a root rot disease on part of their roots, they'll have this sort of rounded curved top, as you see in the picture, instead of a very pointy top, like a traditional Christmas tree. You may also notice distressed cone crops. This is basically a tree's last ditch effort to reproduce before it dies. They tend to be a little off compared to a regular cone crop. So the cones might not be as large, they might be a little disfigured, might be on a tree that just doesn't align up in the same timeline as the healthy trees around it and producing cones. And then lastly, you may see some other sort of secondary bark beetle activity. Not spending a lot of time today talking about bark beetles, but in Western Washington, they love stressed trees in particular, not necessarily healthy trees for the most part. So they'll come in and they'll take advantage of these declining trees, and you'll see them. And sometimes it's more obvious than the root rots because this happens above ground in the stems of trees, these beetles feeding underneath the bark. That doesn't mean that they're not there and part of the system. You just want to get into the habit of, if you see bark beetle activity, also checking for root rots or looking for that underlying stressor of what is attracting the beetles to this tree. So that's a bunch of symptom level information. Tomorrow we'll talk about the signs or the actual confirmation that there's root rot in there. So I do want to do a quick throw out that symptoms, trees only have certain ways to respond to these stressors. So these symptoms aren't all completely unique to root rots. And we should remember to always confirm the presence of root rot pathogens in an area we suspect have a root rot disease. And I'll talk you through how to do this tomorrow. But there are other things that can have some subset of these symptoms that might trick you in the field. So just a reminder to keep an open mind and try to look at the big picture. And what I don't want is for you to see root rots everywhere, even when they're not there after this talk. So some other things that might trigger you to look for root rots could be sort of an area of bark beetle attack, but is driven by a different stressor. So like a wind throw event from a storm could let bark beetles build up and sort of cause a pocket of decline in some neighboring trees. You might have other damage to roots that lead to this slow decline of the canopy, such as construction damage or flooding or other such things. And then sometimes we see this on younger trees where we have animal damage on the roots, which also can fool you at first into thinking that you might have a root rot. So just a friendly reminder to keep your mind open in the forest. There's a lot of things that can happen and be tricky and look like root rots. So we just spent a lot of time looking about symptoms. I want to walk you through one thorough example and then end with a couple others for you to practice getting a feel of what root rots actually look like in our forest in Washington. Here is a drone image taken of a forest stand near Shelton, Washington, of about maybe mainly of planted Doug fir, about 50 or 60 years old. You can see our car is in the bottom of this picture with a Forest Service road, And this is a site that I spent a fair amount of time at, and so I have a lot of pictures of, and we'll walk you through how we identified this site as a root rot disease pocket, and how we were confident about knowing that. So here's another drone image of the same site. It's a little rotated. The car's now on the top, but the center of the picture still shows the same thing. Just to orient you, there are some forest or road trails going through, as shown on the red line. And this picture is taken in the winter, so our deciduous trees don't have leaves. So I highlighted the red alders at Old Landing on the north side, or the top side of this picture, and then a little wetland area with some dead trees and some hardwoods sort of in the bottom right. As we were walking through this stand, things that stood out to us that I can point out from this picture are, of course, the Douglas fir. I've tried to put an X on each one of these. That, at least from this aerial image, you can see where there were. This tends to be a little easier to do on the ground. Additionally, we noticed some hardwood regeneration happening of young hardwoods and some young susceptible regeneration. And what's not easy to mark here is also the lack of sort of the mature overstory in that center area is also a big indication that we might be dealing with a root rot. Now, if we go to the ground, same site, this is pictures of standing on the ground. There's a couple things that sort of start making us think that this might be a root rot pocket. First of all, you see that there's not really a lot of canopy level trees, or if there are, they're dead. Of the ones that are still there, we have old dead, so they have no branches left. They've been dead for a while. We have recent dead, which have fine branches left. We have alive but fading trees. These are definitely easier to see in person than the photographs, but there were a bunch there. And then we have this hardwood regeneration coming in, taking advantage of this sort of canopy gap caused by the dying top trees. Here's another picture of the same site, just a panorama photo, just to point out similar things. We have recent dead that have branches, old dead with no branches, alive but fading trees on the edges, and hardwood regeneration in the middle. Looking down a little bit, again, this one's easier to see in person. Well, the hardwood regeneration is obvious, but the jacksaw pattern in fallen trees is more obvious in person as you're like sort of crawling over all these trees that are pointing in all sorts of different directions. And these are even older dead than the ones that are standing without branches. Additionally, on the ground, we have the trees that have fallen have failed mainly in their roots, where there is rot, no roots, or at least the failures are happening in that general location. Another important thing to keep your eye on. And then the stumps themselves, not just looking at the trees that have fallen, but identifying where the stump is that the tree fell from, have also a lot of rot associated with them. Now, this site here is one of our research sites, so it was harvested and planted with alternative species. But during this harvest, you could see the staining in some of the cross sections of the symptomatic or even some of the healthy trees surrounding it that weren't yet showing symptoms. And this is something that we usually don't get to see in the field because we're not the ones cutting down the trees, but can be important for management options that you'll hear about on Wednesday. So you can see the discoloration and then also some rot and lack of structure in some of these woods. Up and there's some arrows pointing it out. So hopefully that gave you a sense of, in detail, what we look at for the sort of stand level, this might have root rot indications on a specific site. Now we have a few minutes left. I'm going to go slowly through a few more pictures, and I want each one of you guys to look at them and just practice thinking about where in the picture there might be a root rot pocket and why do you think that. And since there's enough people here, we won't have people put it in the chat, but please do this actively by yourself. I put a little cheat sheet on the right-hand side that shows the sort of stand level things I talked about and also the tree level. These pictures, you'll mainly just see the stand level things, but take a moment, try to find where there's a cluster of declining or dead trees. Maybe you see trees in different stages. These images won't really show you the jacksaw pattern of fallen down trees. but you might see some of the regen of younger trees or other species. And again, this drone image was taken in the winter, so our hardwoods do not have leaves and look like they are dead, but they're not. So hopefully you guys all notice this little region right there. That would be the first place I would target walking into the stand, wondering if there's root rot and looking more closer in there. And we'll talk about how to look more closer and confirm that tomorrow. Here's another picture, and here's our cheat sheet again. What triggers root rot in your mind for this location? Okay, hopefully you notice the lack of canopy there, indicating sort of a pocket of decline and fallen trees. There's some dead standing trees, and pretty much this entire picture is pointed towards that canopy opening caused by a root rot disease. Here's another stand example. Again, this one's pretty easy. It's basically the entire picture, but notice the other tree species coming in and thriving, and the dead or declining, and the different ages of that. And then this last example is a shout out to Eastern Washington, just in case that there was anyone here from Eastern Washington. Root rots look fairly similar at this stage out there too. So here is a ponderosa pine site out in Eastern Washington, where there is a pretty clear root rot pocket there where all those symptoms do apply. Okay, so the last thing I want to say is I want to point you towards an ID resource. It talks about what I talked about today, and we'll go into detail about what I talk about tomorrow. I'm going to, if I can pull this off, send this link to everyone in the chat, so you don't have, there you go, don't have to type it in or take a picture of this. This is just an online resource for a field guide of the common diseases and insect pests of Oregon, Washington. Has a ton of information in it. I think it's organized well and easy to use. Root rot section starts on page 62 and talks about these sort of big picture root rot symptoms initially before going into specific species and what to look for, which will match what we talk about tomorrow. So with that, that's day one. I'll stay around for the next however long it takes to answer your questions. Just a reminder, 3 more days of this. So if you have questions about upcoming topics, I'll probably just ask for you to hold off and see if I answer your questions, and then if not, ask them at the end. And with that, if I don't get to your question, feel free to reach out. My contact information is there, and I'm hoping Patrick has been monitoring the chat for any questions. Sorry about that sound issue in the beginning. I caught up pretty well by talking quickly, so hopefully you didn't miss much.
You did, yeah. You were only 2 minutes over, which is really impressive, considering, yeah, we lost, I think, about 5 minutes there. So, and sorry about the technical issue there. Great job. I really liked the examples, and in my head, I was thinking about how we could do like a story map or something, like with photos. It's another project for when you and I have tons of time, right? But no, there are several pictures in the questions in the chat, and I will run through them for you. Some of them do sound like they will be covered later. The first question included was from Kyle. He asked how thinning can make the rot problems better or worse. And Dan actually chimed in and said thinning will be discussed on Wednesday. Should we hunt that one off, and for the sake of spoilers? Yeah. The answer is it depends, and Dan will talk about it on Wednesday. That being said, if he doesn't answer your specific question, feel free to reach out, and we can do a deeper dive on your specific property if you need to. Perfect. So Elena, it sounds like she's actually has taken the coach planning class, which is great. She says, We talked a lot about Douglas fir root rot on the west side. During this week, will we talk about other species such as hemlock or cedars or pines? I assume she's referring to diseases that affect hemlock, cedar, and pine.
Yes, we will cover other things. So just out of experience, Doug fir does get the majority of our attention in the day-to-day work we do with laminated root rot. So we will spend time on other species as well, definitely.
And just a reminder, please feel free to hang on and type questions into the chat as we're doing this. Rachel and I will hang out until we get them all answered, or until about 1 o'clock or so, whichever comes first. All right, so Russ asks, does this mostly apply to evergreens?
No, these sort of stand level and tree level symptoms do apply to hardwoods as well. We don't see nearly as much as that in Washington as you would in, say, the East Coast, but yeah, the sort of overall symptoms do look the same.
Curtis asked, do our opportunistic hardwoods reestablishing in root rot pockets have any effect on the root pathogens in the soil?
We'll talk more about their disease cycle or their life cycle tomorrow, which hopefully will let you understand the full picture. But short-term answer is they don't hurt the root rot pathogen, but they're not a food source for these pathogens. So it's not providing them any additional resources. And so over time, if enough hardwoods establish in areas of root rots that can't cause disease on hardwoods, they will sort of starve out of that area. And again, we'll talk a lot about this specifically on Wednesday about management, because that is basically the underlying tool we use for management, is to starve these fungi out by not giving them tree species they like to munch on.
Russ has another question. This is a good one. I'm curious what your opinion is, since you spend so much time on forest health stuff. Is winter the best time to examine the forest? Or if not, what season is your preferred?
Oh man, I mean, all seasons are good. I don't like the crazy heat if we have a heat wave, but I mean, for this type of thing, snow is our biggest limiting factor. There are definitely areas of the state that if someone reaches out now, we will be like, we'll see you in the late spring, summer. Otherwise, you can look for root rots all year round. As long as you can access the site and get to the roots of the trees and it's not buried by snow.
Right.
Yeah, if you were dealing with hardwoods and root rots, if that was your concern, I would say wait for the growing season so you can have leaves out and you can easily tell what's alive or dead.
Right. Right, so let's see here. I completely lost my space. Someone thanked you for the examples. They really enjoyed those. I did too.
Oh, good.
Let's see. Oh, here's a question from Jay. Hemlock is hard hit by white root rot in my stand. Is that common?
Root rots are site specific and not necessarily sort of a regional problem. So if you have a specific root rot on your property, it will be something that your property will deal with for the foreseeable future, at least in our generations. So common in the sense that it is something that you will commonly see for the rest of your property. Large scale, it's really hard we have a hard time monitoring root rots in a large scale because they are something that are just here. They don't get picked up in our aerial detection surveys very well at all. And it's something that goes ignored in a lot of our forests. So I would say hemlocks having root disease problems is something that we see. So it's not an outlier.
Yeah. And one of the things I learned from like the aerial survey is that root rot and bear disease or bear damage are lumped together because they look so similar from the air, which is really interesting.
So especially on young stands in particular,
Right.
Those two will look very similar. in older stands, they might come up as like Douglas fir beetle in Western Washington might actually mean you have a root rot problem because what's driving that beetle. But that doesn't show up as obviously from the air.
We got a question from Tammy Makita. Hi, Tammy. She asks, can you define the term resinous or resinosis? Sorry. Sounds like
Resinosis.
yeah.
Yeah. It's like the production of resin on a tree. So in the case of root rots, this happens at the base of the tree where there's resin being pushed out of the wood through the bark, and you can visually see it easily by your naked eye. This is something that if it's there, you'll see it. You don't have to look too hard for it as long as you're tromping through your forest and looking at your trees.
All right. So it sounds like Chuck has a question. Is global warming or climate change increasing the presence of root rot? Is there any connection there? No, so far, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. Sometimes there's like clear links to what we're seeing with our pathogens and pests and climate change, and other times it's a little hazy. With root rots, I guess the thing I would think about would be our trees will be stressed for additional reasons. The majority of root rots here are native, and I'll say this again more in the future, but the majority of tree root rots in Washington are native, and they're co-evolved with their trees. And what we don't see as we're standing on the surface of the ground is underneath, there's like a fight going on. The root rot and the tree are trying to both win to get that resource of the root. So if the tree is more stressed, it doesn't have as much resources to protect itself, and that root rot might be able to move faster through the tree and cause tree decline faster that way. So that's one answer, that the root rot might be able to speed up its spread and killing trees. The other answer is that trees with root disease on their roots are more susceptible to be killed by drought, just because they don't have as many root resources. So that's like on an individual tree, just its status of the roots during like a hot drought would be important. But the root rot pathogen also would maybe succeed if that hot drought didn't kill the tree more, just if the tree was more stressed.
Thanks. Tamara has a question. Are root rots generic in firs, i.e. is grand fir the same as Doug fir in reference to root rots? Are they kind of lumped together?
Oh, great question. I will talk about this right away tomorrow. Host preference on root diseases is very important, especially when we think about identifying. And Doug fir and true fir, grand fir is a part of the true fir group, and Douglas firs are not true firs. So they are, despite their confusing names, separate. They're in the same family, but they are in some ways very different trees, and the root rots have different preferences on what species they go for. And I'll show you a bunch of charts tomorrow to reference depending on what trees you have on your property to figure out what root rots you might have. So they are different. They aren't lumped together, though there are some root rots that you may find on both. So it might be different levels of severity.
We got a couple.
That's a huge thing. Doug fir is not a true fir.
Yes, yeah. So we have a couple pretty unique questions here, and I'll let you take a quick stab at them if you don't mind.
Sure.
Diane asks, how influential on Doug fir roots is animal urine? Can repeated dog urine within drip line kill trees? And it sounds like he or she manages a small acreage where dogs are prominent. Basically, a lot of dog traffic on this property. Wondering if there's any potential impacts from that.
Wow, I've never seen that happen. It does not mean it's not happening. And my gut reaction is if you have a really young seedling, that might be a big deal, but an older tree, I can't imagine it. Now, that being said, cormorant roosting sites can kill trees with all of their feces. But
Sure.
those are pretty extreme scenarios. So I suspect not. It might be something else making your trees decline.
Well, and I
Instead
don't
of the
know if
dog
if
urine.
they actually are experiencing any issues.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, they
I
did lose one.
wouldn't lose sleep over it, but
Yeah,
who
right.
knows?
No, I mean, yeah, it's basically, I was gonna say the same thing, because I mean, you're with a young seedling, you could burn it essentially with all the nutrients that are in the urine, but otherwise, I think a normal tree or a older tree should be fine. So another
Yeah.
sort of unique question. So Jennifer has read about her Hanaki cypress susceptibility to Phytophthora and is wondering if she should plant that in her Western Washington yard. So maybe it's kind of a larger question about Phytophthora. I know a lot of folks have heard about that and how it could influence, tree selection, whether that's in a yard or in a forest.
Yeah, Phytophthora. I'll talk about Phytophthora lateralis on Thursday. That was my
Okay.
plan. So maybe that's best to be saved there. That being said, one of the most important thing I would say in your yard, if there's no indication that you currently have a root rot problem, I wouldn't worry about it. If you are in a forest and you have a root disease problem, what species you plant is a very important decision to make, and one that will be the basis of Wednesday's management options. So in the scenarios that you do know you have root rot problems, do pay attention. I'll talk more about Phytophthora on Thursday, if that's enough for now.
Yeah, and Dan mentioned too, it's safe, and especially if you can keep the soils from waterlogging, because that can influence.
Yeah. Yep, and I think Dan will be talking to you on Wednesday, so take his advice.
Yeah. So David asks, and this may be another question to punt to management, because he says it looks like root rot spreads from tree to tree. What stops it from spreading throughout the entire stand?
Yes, we'll start talking about sort of the disease cycle or life cycle tomorrow, and hopefully you'll understand how that happens. And then on Wednesday, you will learn about ways to limit that spread. But yes, the disease spread from tree to neighboring tree is basically what we try to target with management.
And Wes has another question about thinning. I'm going to go ahead and also skip that one, Wes, and just make sure you tune in or watch the recording on. It sounds like was it tomorrow or when? I think Wednesday we're going to talk about.
Wednesday, correct? Yeah.
Let's see. Becky asked, how can I get a recent photo from the air for my 37 acres on the Olympic Peninsula? My recommendation would be Google Earth. They keep pretty updated photos. Do you have anything?
That sounds good to me. I know our service foresters are better at that than I am.
Yeah, that's true. Go to the landowner assistance website that we plugged in earlier, Becky, and you can get a site visit and some aerial photos probably.
Yeah. Our aerial detection survey doesn't take photos. It's just staff on the plane recording what they see. So I can share a link here. I'm on stop share, so I can get that link for you if you want to look at, if I can pull off the ADS data for your property, though you do have to remember it's a sort of big picture scan. PowerPoint, how do I get out of you? Because I think I have that link just in case. Yeah, okay. I will share that in the chat if anyone wants to look into aerial detection survey data. Though, just as someone who's been on the plane, it's big picture things. You don't want to zoom in super close and be like, oh, I'm just out of the polygon, or I'm just in the polygon. Always ground data is better than what you can see from the plane, but this helps us see big picture changes in our landscape. And here it is in the chat.
Perfect, thank you. Well, we have a comment from Suzanne here, just mentioning that for folks on the east side, larch can look very dead in the winter because it is a deciduous conifer. So that's a good comment from Suzanne when you're
Yeah,
thinking about
that
root
is you're right. For those on the east side, definitely don't look for root rots in the winter. Wait for those leaves on your larch.
Day asked, is sequoia more resistant to white root rot?
So I'm assuming when you say white root rot, you're talking about armillaria root rot. If it's just white rot in general, there could be a couple different diseases that you are referring to. I'm not super familiar with sequoia because it's not something native here. I would have to look, but I will show you all the resources tomorrow so you can look it up yourself. And also, if you have any other tree questions after about different species, I do not know that one off the top of my head.
So Martha asked how many people were attending the webinar, just kind of for reference. And if you're still on, Martha, we peaked at about 186 people, I think, something close to that. So Wayne has
Great
a
fun fact.
question. What's that?
That's a great fun fact.
Yeah. So Wayne asked, and he says this could be a management question for Wednesday, but I think it might be relevant to today's conversation. How contagious is laminated root rot? For example, could a non-infected part of the forest be contaminated by staging firewood, rocks, or soil removed from the root rot pocket?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I can answer that now just to make sure we're all on the same page. For laminated root rot, actually for the main 3 root rots we'll be talking over the next couple of days, you don't have to worry about moving it around. They're native, they're already here, and the movement of tree material around is not a good way to infect in an area. It's just not active. Did I just lose my connection?
No, I think we can hear you.
Oh, okay. It's just my video then.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can move firewood around, you can move trees around for landing. It takes a lot to infect a new area. The one exception being like Phytophthora, but I'll talk about that on Thursday.
Right. So getting close to the end here. We're almost coming up on 1 o'clock. Just a few more questions. Judy asks, aren't there some fungal mycelium that are helpful to Doug fir?
Oh, yeah. So I always like to plug the good things, and I'm sorry I didn't do that earlier. There's a lot of fungi in our soils and our forest systems that don't cause disease, and we like them. And, if you're me, you also like the ones that cause the disease because they're interesting and help our forest stay diverse. But you'll easily find lots of resources out there about mycorrhizal fungi, which basically expand root networks and help. They're specific fungi species that sort of have a mutualistic relationship with tree roots and help the tree get nutrients in exchange for sugars. They're very cool, very important, and a lot of the mushrooms, for example, we see in our forests are those. So yes, not everything you see that's fungi is a pest or pathogen on trees.
It's good to know. So we have another question here. Would root rots have a more dramatic effect, i.e. affect larger numbers of trees in a middle-aged or younger stand of conifers when compared to old growth trees? I ask this considering the expansive roots that support an old growth tree when compared with the expansive roots supporting a younger tree. On the other hand, perhaps old growth roots are more interconnected with other conifers. So yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we'll look at this tomorrow and in the life cycle, but it takes time for root rot to infect new trees. So if you were only interested in keeping trees on like a Christmas tree farm for just a few years, and they were well spaced apart, you probably could avoid a lot of long-term root rot spread from tree to tree. That being said, Christmas tree farms are pretty close together, so I think that wound up in a bad example. But typically we see root rot impact increase as forest stands age. So just more time for the pathogens to make it to the tree, spread to neighboring trees, and then kill trees. So older stands tend to have higher levels of root rot. That being said, depending on your land use history, if you have a site with a lot of root rot already present there, it can impact young trees with fairly significantly fast.
Okay. Great. Well, that was our last question. We did have one more question from Betsy about some branches dying on her cedar. Betsy, I'm going to be typing in the link to the Find Your Forester tool, which is a part of the landowner assistance portal. So I really, better, rather than us speculating on what's causing that, it's probably best that you get a site visit from a forester who can take a look at that personally. So I would check out that link. You can find what forester works in your area, and they can come out and take a look at your trees. And something I recommend for any landowner that's listening in right now. It's a really great resource. So yeah, it is 12:56. Had lots of questions, good conversation. Thanks to everybody. Thank you, Rachel. Really appreciate it. And we will be back same time tomorrow.
Yes, and I will be calling in right away so we don't have any issues with sound. Because we have more to cover tomorrow. I won't have as much free time at the end.
Fair. All right. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow.
Yep. Thanks all. Bye.